And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. A long history of competition between China and the U.S., really? Chances of keeping it healthy and constructive, whether the negotiator will bring us some answers right after this break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing. Next, we turn to Washington, where efforts to fix the China-U.S. trade disputes are underway. Top U.S. and Chinese negotiators wrap up the first day of trade talks on Thursday, spending 8 hours behind closed doors. The meeting for the 13th round of high-level consultations, the first time in more than 2 months, kicked off amid a delayed U.S. tariff hike scheduled the next week. The tariffs were supposed to be raised on $250 billion worth of Chinese imports, from 25% to 30%. Not only has the trade war adversely affected both economies, but has a domino effect for the rest of the world, the global economy as well. So this year is the 40th anniversary of China-U.S. ties, diplomatic relations, in fact. Bilateral relations are now a mix of growing cooperation and competition, in some words. How should the two sides chart a course for the future? Could the trade talks help end the battle, or at least set up a path for more substantial negotiations further down the road? And the questions go on. For more about that, joining us in Washington, D.C., William Li, the chief economist from the Milken Institute, and in the CGTN Shanghai studio, Professor Shunding Li from the Center for American Studies at Fudan University. Welcome, gentlemen, to both of you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Professor Shen, I want to start with you. How much hope you pin on for this round of negotiation or trade consultation for at least some scratchy deal, if there were any, to be reached between the two sides?
Well, I think President Trump has indicated his goodwill to conclude the first day of the 13th round of the high-level talk. And right now, the two teams are continuing their efforts in Washington for second day. And probably in 1 hour's time, President Trump will meet with Chinese Vice Premier Liu He. All this bode well for some breakthrough for this round of talk. I would not expect for a complete success, but I think there are signs that both are serious in pushing for some breakthrough.
Of course, it's not fair if I don't ask the other side. How about your assessment, Mr. Li? We were just a few days ago talking about this. Now it's really coming.
Yes, as I said a few days ago, the victory in talks is that we keep talking. And I think the big victory that we see today is President Trump's latest tweet that says there are warm feelings that have come about from these talks, and there are expectations of good things to happen in the future. And I think that's the kind of takeaway message that certainly the financial markets are taking, and also that all of us should remember that talks between two countries is never done in 1 or 2 settings. Even 13 settings would be a beginning of a process.
Now, the two countries' issues between them is not necessarily going to be handled just within 8 hours negotiation. We all understand that. But Professor Shen, many take the trade negotiation as very important signal about whether there is going to be a future and the nature of the future between the two countries. Is that too much hope to pin on a negotiation like this? Or people actually are quite pragmatic, reading the signs or the tea leaves in the teacup, putting on the negotiation table?
Well, I think both sides are serious in making a deal. But the trick is how to do the process of giving and taking.
Exactly.
Both want to want to take more and give less. And then they try to balance and rebalance and rebalance. And so I'm sure this would not be the last round before concluding a deal, but this would be one more effort toward a final deal. So China knows what the U.S. would need and how we could give America something in order for America to give us something. Therefore, I think after talking for so much, they know how to approach to a success in a more mature way.
I hope that is the case right now, but Mr. Li, if you look at what's going on right now, before the negotiation, the latest round, both sides were putting on bargaining chips on the table, as many as possible, ranging from sports to investment to sensitive buttons that both sides feel about each other, and the list goes on. But the question really is, if there were no or little positive signals coming out of the 2 days, or maybe more than 2 days, how will all these areas become, in a way? And how long will the list continue to build on what already happened? I guess that's something a lot of people are having a big question mark. Mr. Li.
That's a very important question, and let me even frame it in a different way.
Go ahead.
These are not just trade talks. These are talks that will be framing and structuring the whole process for the next century, because the United States and China are the two largest powers, economic powers and political powers in the world right now. And the stage is being set for how the world will be governed by the dominance of these two countries in the next century. So the process is not just about trade, it's about interactions politically, culturally, education, sports, the entire gamut. Remember in the history of China, when the Tang Dynasty opened up to trade with the West, that was when a lot of revolutionary changes occurred, not just for trade and economics, but also culturally. And I think that's what's being set the stage for coming up in the relation to the U.S. So we should be patient in terms of understanding that all of these topics that you brought up, the politics, the technology, the sports, are all part of a process of these two great powers integrating the global economy for the 21st century.
Right. Since you raised the example of the Tang Dynasty, it was rather not necessarily an interaction between China and the West, quote unquote, but China with the rest of the world. The Silk Road was a great crystallization of it. And now China wants to push forward the Belt and Road, which is being termed as the modern Silk Road. Putting that aside, Professor Shen, let me ask you a question similar to the nature of what I just asked Mr. Li for his input. That is, how should we read the earlier signs of quite some, at least verbal conflicts between the two countries on various views? And now, will this round, signs coming out of it, be a determining factor, at least on some of the earlier sensitive buttons we already talked about?
Well, with China's dramatic rise, China considers that it's a high time to reclaim its rightful place in the world. And China can do a lot that other powers have already done by framing its idea and improving its international institutions, trade system, and international disaster relief, etc., etc. China thinks it's my job. I have to raise some idea for others to agree or disagree. And this is something that China has not done for the last century, and America has done for the last 70 years. So Americans think China is repeating what the U.S. has done in the past to play a central, pivotal leadership role that the U.S. has difficulty to accept. So U.S. tried to use the so-called rule-based game to regulate China's behavior. And China tried to frame additional rule to make itself more free and to more influence the development of the world economy. So they want to U.S. wants to defend its leadership role, and China wants to reclaim the role it used to have, and China wants to fly even higher.
So you are
so
saying,
I think,
Professor...
these 13 rounds of...
Go ahead, sir. Sorry to interrupt.
I think these all 3 rounds of talks actually are rebalancing their position on trade, investment, and on many aspects of my Washington counterpart has indicated about how the future would evolve in the 21st century.
Mr. Li, time, and time. It's a very important factor. It's not only important because there's an election in your country. It's also important because China is developing and the U.S. is developing at the same time. And it's also important because there has to be a bottom line that at least the negotiators will be able to achieve before people feel confident about the next round. So how do you make about the time factor, Mr. Li?
Yeah. Absolutely a vital factor in the negotiation process, and that's why the next set of announcements are so critical. We have to have actual progress seen by the world to be able to have credibility that the process itself is ongoing in a positive way. As I said, we're reshaping the entire 21st century geopolitical system here. And in order to do that, every step along the way has to show there is some progress. And I think the nature of the progress is that China negotiators are going to have to remember that, yes, they are introducing new ideas, as Professor Shen said, but these new ideas have to be integrated into how the world economy is evolving. And President Trump is saying to everyone, the world economy is evolving into bilateral relationships, and contracts that are done between 2 countries have to be credible and enforceable. And the discussion now is about enforcement mechanisms. And the difficulty in arriving at enforcement mechanisms is that the 2 countries have very different views of how enforcement is done.
Yeah.
And I think that's the nature of the culture clash that we have to resolve. And the next round of negotiations, when President Trump and President Xi meet in November, I expect some kind of signing of a preliminary trade agreement. But right now, the steps have to be put on the table as to what the credible enforcement mechanisms will be.
Okay, you're talking about APEC summit later in November, of course. But Professor Shen, we have been hearing from various sides that the rest of the world want the leaders from China and the United States and their negotiation teams will be up to their task to be able to bring to the world a satisfying answer in terms of how they resolve the trade dispute and how they see together they will be able to contribute to the future of the world. We even hear a latest letter put out by Mr. Kevin Rudd together with some of the other former leaders from various countries calling on the 2 leaders to be playing a more responsible role. So now, Professor Shen, those are not sporadic cases, but rather you heard the voices all over the world. But at a time when me go first, quote unquote, is the slogan, do you think those voices from the rest of the world will be ever heard, at least in some capital?
Well, I think these voices are reasonable, and as the 2 most important countries in the world, China and the U.S. actually share the responsibility not to disappoint these people, this country. Kevin Rudd from Australia, and he is leading ASPI at the Asian Society Policy Institute in New York. But how to make a good deal acceptable to both? Near the end of April, the 2 countries have already reached certain kind of draft agreement. They agreed for some 150 page plus points. But why they cannot conclude it? China has some reasonable expectation that this mutual giving and taking should be balanced and rebalanced. And in particular, we suggested that both countries should conclude the trade war at the same time. And no one should continue to wage a war while the other side has ended. Second, if the U.S. would relaunch, would escalate the war and demanding China not to respond, that's totally unsymmetrical. And finally, for all this kind of diplomatic work, they ought not to be totally public, because it's a secretive talk, and the two governments would accept the final agreement, but it's hard for public to understand why you make this concession. American would blame their leader, and many Chinese audience would have difficulty understanding a publicized computer text. So we think the text should be balanced. But regrettably, Washington, the White House was not thinking this way.
I see.
That destroyed, torpedoed the process. If Trump would go back to take a more cooperative approach, I think the two sides still have great hope in achieving a balanced, mutually beneficial agreement.
Got it.
Anytime soon.
Okay, Professor Shen seemed to suggest, Mr. Li, if I could interpret, leadership style, very important. Mutual respect, at least the Chinese way of seeing the mutual respect, extremely important for reaching a deal, any deal. Mr. Li, take away from here.
I believe that President Trump has shown a massive respect for China and President Xi Jinping, because I think one of the key relationship building measures they've taken is to have personal relations with each other. And I think President Trump's approach is one that tries to make that respect public. Now, Professor Chen is right that the details of negotiations are done in private and should be done in private, but there should be periodic announcements to, as I said, make the process continue to be credible in the world eyes. And right now, the way the process broke down in spring was that the process of contract enforcement was not put on the table in a credible way, and I think that's where both sides really had to shut it down, because the world would not believe a contract between these two countries without a credible enforcement process.
If we go into details, we're going to have to deal with days and nights of debates. Of course, that's exactly what the negotiating teams are doing from China and the United States. But before we go, 10 seconds for every one of you, 10 seconds only. What do you think this round, Mr. Li?
I think this round has great hopes of continuing forward, and I think President Trump has expressed that, and I am expecting some kind of a preliminary agreement to be signed when President Trump meets President Xi in November.
Okay, Professor Shen, 10 seconds.
I second Mr. Li in Washington. I am optimistic to see some progress that could satisfy both. But I would not think the two sides can iron out all challenging difficulties at this time.
All right. Thank you so much, both of your insights and also your analysis from different perspectives. Shen Ding Li, William Li. Really appreciate it. Have a great weekend, gentlemen. Thank you so much.